This episode is brought to you by Indie Film Hustle Academy, where filmmakers and screenwriters go to learn from top Hollywood industry professionals. Learn more at ifhacademy.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Julian Higgins. How you doing, Julian?
Very good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for being on the show, man. First of all, congratulations on getting into Sundance. You have won the lottery. It is all downhill from this point on. The truck of money should be coming in at any moment now, right? Dumping into your front yard.
It's backing up to my house right now, actually.
Right, and your next movie should be about $200 million, right? That's general, and you can do whatever you want with it, right? Is that the way it works?
That's what I've observed. That is what I'm expecting. Yeah. Honestly, it really is like you said. It's like winning the lottery. It is an incredible privilege to be involved at all and to be included. So we are super excited as a team to be sharing the movie with the world this way.
Absolutely. There's no question. I joke about it because a lot of filmmakers think that that's the way it goes. Oh, you got into Sundance. That means it's smooth sailing from here on out. And I always just like, no, I've been involved with some Sundance films in my day and I've seen it firsthand. It's the beginning.
Yeah. And it's also like, it's the journey was making the movie, you know, and and the catharsis that we felt when we finished it is the best, you know. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into the whole process, but
yeah, absolutely.
You know, this is all kind of, honestly, you don't expect anything else beyond just trying to finish it. So
that you got a movie made is a miracle in itself, let alone in these trying times. And we'll go into what happened in the middle of your shooting of this film. But before we go down that road, man, how did you get started in this ridiculous business?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I had an instinct as a really small child to draw. That was sort of the first kind of creative instinct that I had, was drawing. And I think it was just, you know, I grew up in rural New Hampshire. I was an only child. I was a pretty imaginative kid, and drawing was just a natural outlet. But it translated also pretty naturally into acting. I mean, when I was pretty young, I realized that there were actual human beings in these movies that got to go on these adventures, you know? And for me, it was pirate movies. I wanted to be a pirate real bad. And so something clicked for me at one point that, you know, you could actually be an actor and go be in a pirate movie. And that became my one goal from about second grade onward.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And like, you know, then that sort of developed into a much more serious love of acting. I mean, that was really, for most of my youth, especially, I mean, even into college, I thought I might try to actually be an actor. I'm greatly relieved that I'm not, because talk about a tough profession. But yeah, like I think all of that experience, just thinking about acting and doing it and learning about it. And honestly, I'm just kind of a geek about acting. You know, I'm fascinated by all the different approaches and thinking about the interaction between performance and storytelling and all these things. So that has been the most valuable experience I've had as a director. And then somewhere along the line, you know, I think as it occurs to a lot of actors, maybe I should write stuff that I could be in. Mm-hmm. And so acting led very nicely into writing. And then, you know, it was in seventh grade, my friends and I had written a bunch of silly sketches. We were all watching Monty Python, you know, and we were like, we should film some of these sketches just for a couple laughs. And for me, it was very much like the first time I had to think about where the camera would go based on what the scene was about. That was the moment I was like, oh, I see. This is what I'm going to be doing. Like, it was drawing, acting, writing. It was the imagination, the creativity, like all of that came together into this beautiful puzzle that is so satisfying to solve. And every scene you do is a completely different puzzle, so it just never gets old. And so I really haven't looked back since then. And as far as like getting into the business, I mean, I knew, as I said, quite young, this is what I wanted to do. So I went to a school, Emerson, where you get to start your major the first year. That's why I wanted to go. I just wanted to get into it, you know, start making things. And, you know, because I had shot some projects in high school and things, but I wanted to, you know, get into the real thing as soon as possible. And And Emerson was a great, really creative environment. I made a film that I thought represented me really well, and that's what I used to apply to the American Film Institute, which, that was coming out here for the first time to LA, and going to AFI was, led to the work that really opened the doors on my career. So that's sort of, I kind of had the classic, find it young and go to film school approach. But yeah, that's been my focus.
Yeah, I didn't get bit by the bug until I was out of high school. But I was working at a video store throughout high school, so there was that. So that kind of like, hey, I got 3,000 VHS tapes around. Maybe I should do this.
Yeah, and I should say, a major. My parents, my mother writes about film and teaches film, and my father is, a film lover. Like, he just, whenever my mom would go to a academic conference, he would bring home some sweeping war epic for us to watch. So I got like the sort of Truffaut and Kurosawa childhood from my parents. My mom teaches the French New Wave, and so I definitely had a very sort of film snobby upbringing, which I'm so grateful for. But there's a lot of American movies I have not seen yet.
One of my prized possessions is an Akira Kurosawa autograph movie. Oh, wow. Still, that I got in LA. Like it was a pre baby purchase, meaning that I would have a conversation with my wife about it now. They're like, really, we have girls now. What's wrong with you?
Yes, exactly. Before your money had a destination, and before it was even made. Yeah.
Exactly.
I get that. Like my dad grew up watching, big American epics of the 50s as they came out on the big screen, and he has a real kind of nostalgia for like the kind of they don't make them like that anymore movies. Mm-hmm. Like he wanted to make sure I saw Lawrence of Arabia on the big screen as a kid. And I definitely got my love of sort of epic storytelling from him. And then my mother is so, invested in, the filmmakers themselves, and she writes, books on directors and things like that. So I definitely was very aware from a young age that this was like something you could do, and I think that all of that really helped a lot.
Is there any film that kind of lit the fire? That really lit the fire? Was there that one movie you just said, oh man, because we had Shay on, your co-writer on God's Country, and his believe it or not was Rocky IV, and I was like, completely understand that, man. Don't apologize. It was awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like I grew up in such a kind of like movie scholar household, as I've said. I realized my mom had all these films on her shelf, and like. I knew the covers before I had ever watched them, Right. Yeah. And then like one day I was like, Citizen Kane, what is that? Because she keeps talking about that, so maybe I should just watch it. And I just watched it one afternoon, and I realized this may strike some people as funny, but like I realized that I had seen it before. I thought I was watching it for the first time, but I'm actually pretty confident that I saw that movie before I could even like speak or like remember. Like I think I was absorbing a lot of great films and classic films as a baby, really. I mean, I think Citizen Kane was kind of like, I know it's so cliche to say Citizen Kane, but it really was the case. Like that movie was very eye-opening because it has such a fragmentary structure. Sure. It was like, oh, I see. You can tell a story in a totally, non-linear way. And I saw that, I would say, probably in maybe like fifth grade. That's when this happened. And I was already thinking about just like, acting and drama and all that stuff. And that movie really did make me, I watched it over and over again, trying to figure out how it got built, And it's again, it's super cliche to say.
It is, but it's celebrated for. It is and it isn't, because I mean you're literally coming from a family of film scholars, so it makes all the sense in the world that Citizen Kane would be the movie that kind of did it for you, as opposed to like for me I think the first time I even thought about it was E.T. I saw E.T. and I was like what, in first grade or second grade, I went home and started writing a script, which was basically I wrote for a script that's second grade, by the way, and this is what I wrote. young boy meets alien, and that's pretty much the end of that script. So
that's a winner right there.
I think I could sell that for $3 million against a $5 million later. But so all right, so your first feature you got off the ground was Mending the Wall. If am I correct? Is that correct?
Oh, I mean, it's so generous of you to call that a feature. I really do appreciate it. What that is, Mending Wall is a project that it's one of those things. I mean, I made it as a junior and senior in high school.
Okay.
So it was never released or anything. But at the time, of course, I was like, I gotta get this on IMDb. So that's
I know the feeling. I know. So I saw that, but it was 80 minutes. But it was 80 minutes. So I was like, it's technically your first feature.
I had done like I'm gonna call it a feature length video. Okay. So I had done some pretty like ambitious projects if you're like an 8th grader, before that. But like that was sort of the one where I was like, okay, this time I'm going to cast grown-ups in the grown-up roles. It's not going to be my friends playing the roles. So like I actually had some, really lovely community theater actors from the Upper Valley where I grew up. There was like a great regional theater there. So, just trying to find people that knew more than me about, acting on camera. And that was like an incredibly important project for me, just to like go through the entire process from writing it to, trying to fundraise it, even though I think it cost maybe $3,000 over the course of 2 years, but that has turned into my main advice is like, I don't think there's any substitute for just getting stuck into it, like in whatever way you can manage. It doesn't have to be a huge, ambitious, project. It can be something quite small. You need to go through the process as many times as possible. And I'm really grateful that I got to do all those projects when I was in, even before college, just to go through the process,
So,
and it's one of those things where you're the one-man band, like I shot it, I edited it, I learned I was, we didn't even have a boom or like external sound. It was all just in-camera sound, so it was as homemade as it gets.
Well, listen, I feel you. I've been there. I've done that. I completely understand where you're coming from. But you're right. It's kind of like, we're craftsmen. We have to perform our craft, and it's as a writer, you get to write as much as you want. As a painter, you get to paint as much as you want. As a musician, you get to play your instrument. But for directors, it's so difficult for us to practice our art. And the thing is like we spend an entire career not doing our art very much. It's more about getting revved up to get the project up and ground. But the actual on-set directing, it's such a small percentage of our careers that as much of that as you can do is possible, unless you're Ridley Scott. If you're Ridley Scott, you direct 5 movies a month. And
but I think that has been something that I've thought a lot about, especially in the last few years, is how do I create opportunities for myself, very low stakes opportunities to just practice the individual, like exercising at the gym. Like you got to isolate the muscles and just keep them in shape. So like one thing that I've been doing that I think has been critical for me is just, this was pre-pandemic obviously, but I'll start it up again as soon as possible. Just once a week, a few actor friends and I would just get together for a few hours and work on scenes. I would direct them, they would act them. They're not to shoot them. There's not scenes I'm writing. We would just pick good material and just work on it together, just for the exercise.
Yeah.
And I think things like that are so important because, as you say, it's like in the last 5 years, I've been on set as a director for, 60 days in 5 years, and like I'm thinking about it all the time and planning all the time. But like the amount of time that we actually get to do this beautiful thing that we are, we believe are the purpose of our lives, is such a small percentage of that. So
it is the sadness. It is the beautiful sadness of being a director. You just don't get to direct. You just don't get to direct as much as you want, and that's for everybody. By the way, I mean it's not just for the masters as well.
I can see why people are so enthusiastic about television. I mean, you had a great interview with Dan Attias the other day, That, I mean, Dan is just such a
He's a
accomplished
master. He's a
director,
master.
and like
Yeah.
I had the opportunity to shadow him at one point. I don't think he would ever remember, but it was on House. And, you know, the executive producer of the show, Greg Utanis, who, by the way, no slouch, Greg Utanis is also like a very high level. He poked his head in the door. He was like, "That's Dan Attias," you know? Like, anyway, my point is I can see why doing, 300 episodes of television, how appealing that would be to just constantly be working and constantly solving problems and constantly getting into new material. Like, that's extremely exciting.
Now, let me ask you, I mean, so I'm assuming that, out of college, you didn't go straight into, a career making lots of money and just directing all the time.
But you mean like now? Like
now you're obviously, you've arrived. You've arrived already. You're standing on bricks of $100 bills stacked. I understand that. So... no, but generally speaking, but you're more established now. You you directed, you directed features, you've directed television and so on. But when you're starting out, what was that thing that took you? I mean, from Mended Wall to all the way to God's Country. There's a lot of, even up to your first episode of House, which was your first TV job. It took years. How did you keep going? Because so much of what we do is the resilience of just showing up and keep going, even though there's no hope of making it the way you want to, but yet you keep going. So what is it for you?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because in film school or whatever, you hear stories about, like I remember hearing Derek Sean France took him 10 or 12 years to get Blue Valentine made. And at the time I was like, oh my God, I don't know if I could do that. And now it's like, it took 5 years to get God's Country made. And it was so enjoyable. Like, even though it was really difficult at times and like it definitely presented all kinds of unforeseen challenges, the fact of engaging with a project that you really care about, that means something to you and is, deeply personal in that way, carries you along through thick and thin. So it never really feels, I mean, here's the thing. I was extremely fortunate to have parents that weren't trying to talk me out of being a filmmaker.
Right.
They were, it goes back to the parents again, as always, like they were so encouraging of my creative interests. They never tried to say, well, we want you to be a doctor or a lawyer in the classic story, Mm-hmm. And then I had a school system around me that allowed me to do the things that I was excited about within the program. My high school had an independent study elective where you could work on your own project. You had to propose it, but if you got granted the opportunity, you could work on that's how I made Mending Wall.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's like, and then Emerson and it's such a nurturing environment, and then AFI is a very brutal environment, but it's like it puts you to the test. The learning curve is very steep, and so really what the thing that has carried me along is I have never felt like there's no hope when I'm working on a project that I feel is extremely personal to me and like emotionally compelling to me. Because then I have something that keeps my eye on the future, Mm-hmm. And so for me, if you look at you referred to the years that I spent. I mean, for me, it was a sequence of projects. I don't even think of it as years, like I kind of lose track of how long things take. But what I know is that I made a string of projects that at the time I poured my heart and soul into and did the best I could do with, whether they came out, I don't know that there's an objective like, oh, this is great, this is not great. But, obviously you always have complex feelings about your work. Mm-hmm. But like, I don't regret any of it because you always try to find your way into the project, whatever it is, and what speaks to you about it. And then you grab that and you develop it as much as you can. And God's Country is no different,
Now, so you got your first TV directing job was House. Not a bad first TV gig, by the way. Not bad at all. You're coming in on the tail end of, I think it was the last season, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it was actually, there were only 7 episodes after mine.
Right. So I
really did catch the tail end.
You got the tail end of it. And So I have to ask you the question because I know how it felt when I first walked on set of a real set. What was it like? You were what? Like, how old were you? You were
So I was
26?
26 at the time, and
Right.
the director that I mentioned before, Greg Utanis, is the one who really, made that opportunity happen for me. He was the producing director on House at the time. And he, once again, like, it really does come down to the work ultimately. Like, I would not have been able to even enter that that opportunity at all if I hadn't made a short that really represented who I wanted to be as a director, which was Thief, my AFI thesis film.
Right.
And Greg just, this is not, a plan you can make. You know what I mean? Like, the plan has to be, I'm going to do the best job I possibly can with the projects I choose to work on, with the resources and the people that I have at the time to work with. And, so Thief was, at the time, I felt like this is the best I can do. And putting that out in the world is kind of where that ends. Then you have to start thinking about the next one. And, but Greg was actually the presenter of an award that the movie won. And that was the first time I met him. I saw him on stage, he presented the award, I happened to win. And then backstage he was like, hey, are you interested in TV directing at all? It never occurred to me, and I don't think it occurred to him at the time. I can't put words in his mouth, but that I would actually end up directing House. He just wanted to know if it was something I was interested in. And one thing led to another. We had conversations that months went by. He was like, why don't you come shadow me on an episode? It's just sort of slowly built this relationship over maybe 6 months, and I showed up on the show a lot. That's when I watched Dan Attias direct, a lot of other excellent TV directors that I got to kind of learn from and watch. And then I think through that process, he got to know me, what my priorities were, like, how I thought about directing and the work. And he saw that I was really committed to being there and learning as much as possible. And then he actually dropped out of an episode that he was going to direct and gave it to me, which is, in addition to being very generous, it's also kind of like the break that people dream of, Now, that walking on set for the first time as a director, it was Friday the 13th. I kid you not. It was a massive, massive scene in a LA convention center downtown with 300 extras and,
of course,
a techno crane and Steadicam going up and down escalators and like all this stuff. I knew that was going to be the first day. Obviously, I was so excited, but the answer to all the director stresses, in my opinion, is prep. So I knew it was going to be a big day. I prepped the hell out of it, and that I think really helped because I came in with a plan. I knew what I needed. I knew what I didn't need. I wrapped the day on time, which is the most important thing you can do. Anyway, what I found, which was surprising to me, was that the actual job of the director, and what I have to deal with, doesn't actually change that much. Whether it's a pretty small short, an independent feature like God's Country, or a big television show like House, I'm still, at the end of the day, I'm communicating with the heads of department, I'm communicating with the actors. I'm trying to tell the story cleanly and clearly and effectively. It's always kind of the same job. Just the scale of it goes up and down. But, and by the way, directing House was a real treat. I mean, I don't want to, it was difficult like everything, but it was a really wonderful show to work on.
Now, did you ever, because I remember being the young guy in the room. That doesn't happen anymore. Very rarely. It does happen every once in a while now. I'm still the young guy in the room, which I always find like, am I the youngest guy in the room here? That's awesome. But I remember always being the young guy in the room. But when I walked on certain sets, there was the politics of the set that they don't teach you in school. The DP that might be like, no, I'm going to shoot it my way, kid. Or the production designer doesn't want to play, or the actor who doesn't want to play. Can you kind of touch a little bit on how, did that ever happen to you, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me that people would be skeptical. I mean, I think you may be referring to two different types of things. Like, obviously, there's people that are going to act a certain way no matter who it is,
Sure.
But then there's, it's just like I think a perfectly natural skepticism of someone who either visually or for whatever reason just appears to be kind of young, you know? And I think it makes sense actually, because you know, especially if you care, the more you care about what the work you're doing, the more you need there to be trust, you know? And for me, like Hugh Laurie, who I grew up watching his work. I love Hugh Laurie, you know? I mean, he's just an incredibly intelligent actor. And he carried that show on his shoulders. Like he was the one who needed to make everything work. And so when and I had been on the show hanging out, like I don't think anybody knew who I was. I think they maybe thought I was an intern or like somebody's nephew or something like that, you know? And so then to watch that be referred to as the director, I could understand why that's a little alarming, you know? Like, wait a second, that's the director? Now, again, the way that you win the trust of people you're working with, in my opinion, is you do the work before you ever walk on set, you know? I mean, the way you show people that you know what you're doing is you execute the work. And slowly that goes away. But there's absolutely, like for me, I made some strategic decisions. One was I bought a big fat pair of director glasses. You know, like I needed to look like I could make bold decisions.
So like Tony Scott glasses. So Tony Scott glasses.
They are ridiculous. Like if you hunt down some stills from that episode, you'll see these are some big glasses. Mm-hmm. Now it's like, that probably doesn't make much difference, but I actually think certain people didn't recognize me, which frankly helped, you know? But honestly, what it is like there is going to inevitably be discomfort. I mean, I don't know that there's any way you can solve it in advance. Like, there's always going to be a part of someone when there's a new director on a TV show. You know, if you're working on that show every day for months and years, a new person shows up and you're like, okay, are we going to be safe? Like, are we good? And it's totally understandable. You know, and so a big part of, especially the TV directing job, but any scenario where you're, I think, working with new people is, you know, come in ready to work, because that's how you show people what your priorities are, you know, and like that you're paying attention and you are going to listen to them and say yes to their ideas. And like, you know, I mean, the problem would be if I walked on the set of House and tried to tell people what to do. Like, it's not that. It's always a collaboration, even if you're the director, you know? So.
Now, I always love asking this question of directors. You know, we all, when we're on set, there's always that one day that the entire world's coming down upon you. And then I always get from directors, do you mean every day? I will go, yeah, so every day could be, but like there's always that one moment in a shoot or in a movie or in a show that the camera broke, you losing the light, your actor broke an ankle, a COVID hit, something happens. What was that day for you, and how did you overcome that situation?
I do tend to be more of the happy warrior in these in the process in general. I do think I'm very aware of just what a privilege it is to even be able to do this at all, or even consider spending my life force on this, you know? Mm-hmm. So like even the challenges, I do think I do a pretty good job of bouncing back quickly. I think the answer, of course, that comes to mind when you ask that question is, you know, we were making God's Country in Montana, and we were in that perfect window where we started shooting. 3 weeks later, the entire world shut down because of a once-in-a-century pandemic, you know? So, and of course, it was like, oh yeah, of course that would happen, you know? Like, are we ever going to make movies again? Much less will we finish the movie, you know? And you know, we had to make the decision, which was the only decision, obviously, but, you know, to shut down production with about half of the schedule remaining to shoot, and kind of pack our bags and go home with no idea when or even if we would get a chance to finish it, you know? And on top of all the other uncertainty of that time, you know, that was definitely a dark night of the soul for me. Because I don't know, because for everybody, but
I can't even imagine, like, you've got an amazing star, an amazing cast, you've got the movie you've been working on for 5 years, everything's running smoothly, and all of a sudden, yeah, we got to shut the entire thing down because the world is ending, essentially.
Yeah. Exactly.
And what I love about, you said something very, very, it's a sickness that we have as filmmakers. You said, will we ever be able to make movies again? That is where your mind goes first. It's not that the world's coming to an end. It's like, wait a minute, am I going to be able to finish this movie? And that is the sickness, that is the beautiful sickness of being a director.
I mean, for me, it was like, I just don't know who I am if I am not going to be able to make movies. Like, I really did spend some time thinking, like, okay, if this continues forever, like, what if we never come out of lockdown, you know? Like, who am I going to be? And, you know, that was a moment I haven't really experienced a moment like that before. But, you know, to my credit, my manager, Jake Weiner, we were on the phone like maybe 2 weeks into the pandemic, and he was like, I was like, Jake, are we ever going to make movies again? And he was like, yeah, we will, you know? And like, he had no reason to say that in my mind. Like, that was completely, we didn't have enough information to say that. But I seized on those words and I like trusted my manager, you know? And anyway, so yeah, I mean, that decision was clearly like not a difficult decision to make. It was a difficult emotional decision to make, but we had to send everyone home, especially Thandiwe, who lives in England. Like, we needed to make sure that everybody could get home before the world shut down for real. So they pulled the plug on the movie. And like you say, like, it's really about overcoming it. You know, I had a couple weeks there where I've talked about what I was feeling, but then, you know, I will say in hindsight now, it really was largely upside. And I will say the reason for that is we got to stop in the middle of the project and reflect on what we had done, you know, which you don't get to do normally. And it's the way I would want to work. Maybe not a year, you know, maybe not a year of interruption, but like, you know, to stop and be like, okay, let's look at what we have. Let's start editing it. Let's see how it's working. Like, what decisions are, you know, what choices are we making that are really panning out? What choices are we making that, you know, aren't necessary? How are the performances coming together? And then Shay and I, you know, we started rewriting things, and we involved Thandiwe in that process as well. Like, we were talking the whole time we were down. The cinematographer got to weigh in. Like, everybody was looking at the footage, and the value of that, I cannot overstate how much that helped the movie. It is such a better movie now because we had that time to think about, you know, what we had done thus far. And we did have to wait. You know, we shut down on day 17 of the shoot, and then 367 days went by, and then we started rolling on day 18. And so we had, and like, that was an important year. You know, 2020 was an important year for the world, obviously, for obvious reasons, but in America, you know, so many things, I think, provoked by the pandemic really came to the surface, and we started having conversations that were very much the meat and potatoes of the movie anyway. And so, you know, finally a lot of stuff came to the surface as far as, you know, racism and sexism and misogyny and like the interplay between those things and the way we've set up our society, you know, and the movie felt more relevant than when we started even. And so we really went back with a sense of purpose. It felt even more important than ever to finish telling the story. And I think it was also more, sorry, I can go on about it, but I just want to say one more thing, which is the crew all the way down the line, I think because we were all working on it at the moment when the world ended, you know, it was so much more it meant so much more to come back and finish it. It wasn't a gig to anybody that worked on this project. You know, we went back pre-vaccine, you know, we had to implement the strictest safety protocols, you know, and everybody was so committed to doing it. And I think finishing it was like, you know, it may sound a little corny, but like finishing it was the kind of gesture of we can overcome this stuff together if we work together, you know.
That's, yeah, I can only imagine, man. Like I said, when Shay told me the story as well, I was like, Jesus, you went through the ringer, but it was upside. It was a lot of time to reflect, and filmmakers generally don't get to do that. But I also saw your film, Winterlight, which is essentially the precursor to God's Country, correct?
It's really interesting how that happened because, like, you know, the film is based on this short story. James Lee Burke wrote the short story Winterlight in the early 90s. And I read it in 2010 after I finished AFI. And my mom handed me this book of short stories because she's a fan of James Lee Burke. And, you know, Winterlight's the first story in there. And by the time I finished reading it, I knew it was one of those things where you just kind of know, like, this is speaking to me in a way I don't even understand yet, you know, but I know I'm going to have to engage with this. And so for a few years, I tried to figure out how to make it into a short. It is such a contained story. It's a wonderful story, but it's very abrupt, it's very short, and it's very, like, internal character study. So, you know, the whole time I was working on the short, because it was kind of an expensive short, to be honest. Like,
you shot 35 millimeter. Like, how did you guys even get the financing? How did it get off the ground?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the financing came in from a bunch of different places, from individuals, from groups, from grants, we did a small crowdfunding campaign. Like, it was the typical story of doing a short, but just trying to get, you know, trying to kind of pull out all the stops, you know. And my cinematographer and I have a very good relationship with Panavision. So, like, you know, you call in your favors when you're making something like that. Like, you know. And anyway, so we pulled off this short, but the whole time I was like, you know, I don't think there's enough story material here to turn into a feature. Because, you know, the short was so expensive, it was like, okay, why don't we just make a feature? And I genuinely did not think there was enough material there. So it kind of, when I finished that short, I just sort of felt like that was the end of my engagement with it, you know? And flash forward a couple of years, after the 2016 election, the sort of themes of the story really, like, bubbled up for me again. I was driving home from Whole Foods, and it, like, really struck me, like, oh, that is a very relevant story again. And I had this idea, which I'm sure Shay talked about as well. We basically decided to, you know, as a way of kind of incorporating the things that we were seeing happening in the world and in the country that were making us moved and angry and, you know, just sort of agitated. As a way of talking about those things, we decided to repurpose this story and, you know, change this sort of aging white male protagonist to a 40-something black woman in order to have a different view on what was happening. And, you know, the whole subtext of the story changes with that change. And suddenly we were able to get into these things that were making us feel so motivated. I mean, as Shay says, that choice was our kind of activist choice. And I think that's, you know, it was a huge responsibility to tell the story from that perspective. And it took us a really long time and a lot of, you know, attention to translate one thing to another. But it's not exactly your classic, like, short to feature story.
Right. No, without question. But I was just curious about that. When I saw it, I was like, it was a beautiful Winterlight was beautiful. And I was like, okay, I just figured out where it came from, where God's Country came from. Okay, this all makes sense now. Now, I always love asking.
The way I think about it is kind of like it's two adaptations
completely
from the same source material.
Yeah.
But, like, you know, when the script was circulating, if someone had actually seen the short, they would get very confused because these stories are about completely different things, you know?
Right.
And, like, they have some superficial elements in common that are shared by the source material, but it's a pretty radically different meaning and intention to the story.
Now, I always love asking people who get into Sundance what it was like getting that phone call. Because it's just like it is the lottery ticket. It's every filmmaker wants to do it. You know, ever since the '90s of Mariachi and Tarantino and everybody else, Sundance is the holy grail for independent film. So, what was it like getting the call?
You know, it's funny because like it was a text.
No, it was not. No way. They didn't text you. Oh, they called your manager?
No, a programmer texted me directly saying, hey, could you just chat quickly? Okay. And I happened to be on the phone at the time with our producer, Amanda Marshall. And I was like, what does this mean? You know? And she said, well, it's very early in the process, so they're probably checking to see like how you're coming along with the movie and will you be done in time and stuff like that. So I was like very kind of relaxed when I was like not prepared to be told the news. And I honestly, I couldn't process it for like days. You know, it took so long for it to sink in. It did not feel real at all. I didn't think it was like a practical joke or anything like that, but my reaction to it was like, oh. Because another thing is like, we were not done with the film, you know? Right. Like, as I'm sure you've heard many times before, like, you know, people are working on their movies right up until the last second. I mean, we were not done. We had picture locked the film about a week before I got that call. So we still had sound mix, VFX, color, like score, like all this stuff to do. So to me, it was like, oh my God, like, what are we going to do? Now we have our work cut out for us. So once again, it was kind of like, just got to keep going because we want this thing, which right now feels so kind of, it feels like a fantasy of something that could happen in the future. You know, it did not feel real until we actually started getting, you know, programming emails from stuff, you know, and like it really sunk in a long time after. I know that's not maybe the story that is the most exciting, like, but you know, that's really the reality of it for me. Was I immediately thought, oh, well, now we have to finish the movie.
Oh shoot, this is serious now.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna ask you. This just got real. I'm gonna ask you a few questions. To ask all my my guests. What advice would you give a filmmaker trying to break into the business today?
Yeah, I mean, I did touch on this a little bit earlier, as far as like, you know, trying to find ways to go through the process as much as possible, even if it's just for yourself, you know. But I do think that you have control over very few things as a filmmaker. You know, like I do try to really keep my eye on the ball of like, what do I have control over and what don't I? And what I think it boils down to for me is there are basically two things that you actually have control over. And one is generating your own material that you care about in whatever way that works for you, whether it's writing, shorts, spec commercials, like getting together with your friends and making a music video, or even, you know, trying to get an independent film off the ground. Like whatever you can do, generating material for yourself to direct or produce or whatever, you do have control over that. You know, you can generate those ideas. And then once you have those projects that you know you want to do, you have to announce to the world that you want to do them. You know, you have to share what you're making as widely as you possibly can. And like what that means is like every time you finish a short, you should be sending it to everyone you know. And you don't even need to like hear back about it, you know? You don't. No one ever needs to watch it. They just need to know that you're out there doing things and generating things, you know. And then what I have found is if you keep doing that, you keep your eye on the ball of actually making things in whatever way you can manage, and you share it as widely as possible. Right. People will start thinking of you for things, you know, because they know like, oh, once every 6 months, like something's showing up on my inbox. Oh yeah, right. Like Julian, that's cool. He's still out there doing things. That's great. And then that's how they start to think of you. And, you know, what they do with the material you share, you don't have any control over. But I do think those are the things that matter the most.
You know, it's funny. I actually, that's exactly what happened to me when I got a TV gig to do a series. It was a high school friend of mine who followed me on Facebook. He's like, hey, he was an exec at this place. He's like, hey man, do you want to come in and like talk about making this show? And I'm like, yeah, why'd you call me? He's like, I've been following your short that you did like in 2005, and I know you can pull a lot, you can squeeze a lot out of dollars, so that's what we need for this project. And it's so true. It's just literally someone just following me, and he's like, yeah, do you want to do you want to do this
Well, I
job?
heard a beautiful story about this at one point, which is a friend of mine's grandfather was a big fan of Charlie Chaplin when Charlie Chaplin's movies were coming out. And it was that, I guess that was the time when you could just write a fan letter on paper with a pen and like put it in the mail, and it would show up at like Charlie Chaplin's office somehow. So he would just write these letters saying, you know, every time a movie came out, he would write Charlie Chaplin a letter and just send it off. And then I guess later on in his life, you know, he, I guess, was visiting Paris, and he saw Charlie Chaplin sitting at the back of a like little bar in Paris, and he was like, okay, I can't just leave, you know. So he walked up to Charlie Chaplin and was like, you know, Mr. Chaplin, I have been writing you letters for years. I just want to say I'm such a big fan of yours, you know. And they talked a little bit, and Charlie Chaplin was like, why'd you stop writing, you know? And I think that's kind of how it works, you know. Like I do think that is sort of like the basic concept is, if people don't know what you're trying to do, they will not be able to help you, you know? So you do have to let people know. If you finish something, share it. If you are trying to raise money for a short film, let everyone know. You just don't know, and you have no control over how that's going to, you know, work its way through the world.
Absolutely. You have no idea what little thing you do here will affect that little thing. Is kind of like the butterfly effect. You just don't know
exactly
how it's going to happen.
And by the way, like, everyone has stories like that.
Oh, yeah.
That's not like that's just how it works. When it works, that's how it works. It's you keep your nose to the ground and make your work, and you know, keep doing that, because that should be the focus.
Is it just me, or did you also go through the process of deconstructing every successful director that you looked up to on their path of how they got to where they are, and maybe even try to emulate it? So like, okay, I'm going to make a $7,000 action movie in Mexico. You know, like, I'm like, and yeah, I did. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't really like. I would get really fixated on certain directors, and of course watch everything they did, sure. And you know, and then I would go in and like frame by frame try to figure out like how did they achieve that effect. You know, I mean, one director that was really important to me, even though I don't think I will ever make anything that's in that kind of vein, is Terry Gilliam. Mainly because
he's amazing.
Yeah, because his movies are so inventive, and you can see that he has had his hands on every aspect of the movie, you know. And I have no idea what he's like to work with or anything like that, but his movies were so inspiring to me as a young filmmaker, just because they were so specific. And I think that's what I responded to, was when people were able to do something that felt really, really personal and sort of their own strange little worldview,
sure,
but with a bigger budget or something. Like David Fincher, obviously, like his movies are so David Fincher, and yet he's able to do that thing that he does in a big movie.
Well, like, I mean, Time Bandits, let's not even get going. I mean, I remember seeing Time Bandits in the theater when it came out and blew my mind. And Fincher's basically a scalpel. Like, he is so precise. It's like there's sharp edges on everything he does. It's so perfectly constructed. And I had the pleasure of talking to his DP, Jeff Cronenwell, and I was just like, dude, how'd you do Fight Club? How did you do Girl with a Dragon Tattoo? Like, and asking him all these questions and how David works and how he worked with David. And it was just like, everyone listening, you got to listen to that episode. It's absolutely mind blowing if you're a David Fincher fan.
Yeah, I do think that, like, I think for me, it's like, I get very fixated on directors that I think are consistently expressing how they see the world through their work, no matter what kind of thing it is. And lately, my enthusiasm has been about, interacting with the world. When I started as a filmmaker, it was more about the pure imagination, and just like the excitement and, like The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, for example, Terry Gilliam's movie.
So good.
Which is just an extravagant, fantasy. It's just so much fun to be
Can you imagine that being made by a studio today? Like, that's not even a
No, I mean, it almost didn't get made at the time. But
it barely got made then. You're right.
And now I find myself, focused much more on like what kind of conversation is the movie trying to have with the audience?
Right.
What is the movie trying to get the audience to consider? And maybe even for the first time. Those are the things that really attract me now.
Now, what is the lesson that took you the longest to learn, whether in the film industry or in life?
Oh, wow. An easy question.
Sure. This is that tree question. This is the tree. This is the tree. This is the tree question. What kind of tree are you? That's kind of.
Yeah. That's a much easier question to answer. I mean, the thing is, like, I think a lesson that I sort of understood long before I could. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can hear something 100 times and only understand it on the 101st time, And like one thing that I kind of knew intellectually, but didn't really understand, was this idea that it is better to get the audience to ask the questions than to try to give the answers. And I think that is really a life lesson for me as well. Like one thing that I have just been thinking so much about as this movie comes to the end is, you can't force it, really. That's really what it boils down to. Like as I learned in Dune, the mystery of life is not a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. I think that is basically the truest thing that's been said, And I really like, as geeky as it sounds, that trickles down to like the editing process to me, or like what we do. Like that's so deeply true about the mystery of life being a reality to experience. And so, for example, like the first cut of this movie was 2 hours and 20 minutes long. The final cut of it is 1 hour 40. So we cut a lot of movie out of this, and I was noticing that the parts we cut are the parts that are trying to explain things to the audience. I really feel as a sort of value that like I want to trust the audience, but it's so tempting when you're telling a story you care about to try to make things really clear, but actually it's about expressing something and letting the audience consider it.
Agreed 100%.
Yeah.
I agreed 100%.
That's the lesson that I talk about these days.
And last question, 3 of your favorite films of all time.
Yeah, I mean, this is another, how could you possibly? But
Today.
But I think like I'm going to answer this question in the sense of movies that have really influenced me and like inspired me. And, I think like I mentioned Kurosawa, I think he's made such... I am much more of like the epic Kurosawa fan than the sort of social drama Kurosawa fan. But,
sure.
Ron is a movie that everyone, talks about. Throne of Blood's incredible. But the one for me that really, I really encourage people to go see it if they can find it. I believe it's on the Criterion Collection. It's called Dersu Uzala. And it is it's a story about a Mongolian guide leading an expedition in Mongolia for a bunch of Russian cartographers. And it doesn't sound like, a thrill ride.
It's high concept.
Yeah, it's really like, and you should see it on the biggest possible screen. This is a movie, they really don't make them like that anymore. It is such a personal portrait of two human beings, these two men who sort of, in a way, like become brothers in a sense. It's almost a love story. It's like a platonic love story, but it is the like one of the biggest, most sweeping epics ever made. So that's a big one for me. Like the mix of character study and scale is something I really aspire to do. I would say Foxcatcher is a movie that influenced me very deeply. Foxcatcher is like right in the pocket of the kind of movie I want to be making. Yeah, and then I kind of have to go to No Country for Old Men for so many reasons. That's a movie I will never get tired of watching, and I learn something profound from it every time I see it. both in terms of the content and the filmmaking. It's just one of the best movies I've ever seen.
Right, and I think that God's Country is a near Western. You know, it is a modern Western, and there is, and me and Shay were talking about it in our episode, there's no one doing it better right now than Taylor Sheridan. I mean, his High for Water, Wind River, and obviously Yellowstone. I'm obsessed with Yellowstone. Obsessed with it. And it's
Jefferson White from Yellowstone is in God's Country in a very different kind of role as well.
Yeah, when I saw him, I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Jimmy got work. He's fantastic in it, by the way. He's fantastic in your movie. But listen, brother, I appreciate you coming on the show. I wish you nothing but success. Enjoy the ride. It is short. You know, I've talked to a lot of Sundance filmmakers that it's just like, it's a whirlwind. Unfortunately, you won't be able to get there this year because of the world being the way the world is, but enjoy all the benefits and all the wonderful things that come from being in the Sundance Film Festival. So continued success, my friend, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks for having us, me and Shay, both on.